Alrighty, Captain. So earlier today in the Notch user Facebook group, we had a question about how to create an object like this ball I brought in and have it animate so that it would be deformed. Now I made this object inside 3ds Max. I tried to bring it in, but unfortunately you can see that the deformer is actually making a lot of these edges and polys like really naff. So it's not exactly what I was looking for. But what I ended up finding was, I'm using an icosphere here as a tester, is that I can use a clone to mesh for cylinders and a clone to mesh for spheres and have it match the sort of shape for the icosphere. Now let's sort of explain this a bit better. So in our shape icosphere here, I'm just going to turn our lines to visible and just turn everything else off here. So right now you can see that this turbulence deformer is affecting the mesh. So let's go about doing the edges first. So a clone to mesh is the first starting point. I'm going to bring in our combined geometry. So our clone to mesh here is basically going to be set to edge center. By default, it is set to vertex. So we want to go to edge center because we're doing our edges. We also want to change our rotation mode in here to align to normals. So in here, normally it's set to object. So in here, align to normals. I'm just going to play this so it's a bit more interesting in the background. And then the other final thing we want to do, and this is the important one, is we want to go scale clone edges. At the moment, it's going to be crazy. Back into here. And in the cylinder, we just want to make a couple of different changes. We want to set our radius so that the edges touch just the end. I found this is pretty much 4 on the size I've got here. This will vary it, and we'll show that in the next video as well. And we want to make sure the axis here is actually set to Z. Normally it is X by default, which is not super useful for us, but Z is exactly what we want. And now we have all of these edges scaling to the right lengths. Now I've got this set to be invisible here under visibility, and I'm running that into a combined geometry node because I'm also going to add some spheres just to cap the edges here and make them look a little nicer. So similar thing again, we're going to use a clone to mesh. This time we're going to use vertex point, and we are going to just add a sphere. And that sphere is just going to sit in the end there and block it so it doesn't look quite so sideways. Alrighty, so let's replicate this in a new area. So if we go F2, create a new layer or insert new layer, let's call this working. F1 to enter into it. So first things first, we need to look for a shape 3D. So we're going to grab in a shape 3D, drop it in, and we want to change this from a sphere to an icosphere. So icosphere here. Let's, for testing, set our radius to something like 8, so it's nice and large. And it's immediately kind of hard to see. So let's add a directional light and aim that down a bit. So we don't actually want to see the mesh of this icosphere. Like it's cool that it's there, but it's not useful. So we want to come across the visibility and turn that off. And just so we can make it easy to see what we're doing, we want to go to lines, turn those lines and turn them on. So now we can see the edges we're working with. All right, like we said, next we want to grab a clone to mesh. This needs to be connected to the root node, so Control R. And we are going to just feed our source geometry, into our clone to mesh. Now we need something to clone, so another shape 3D. By default, this is going to come in as a sphere, so we want to make that a child of. Now this would work great for the vertices straight away, so let's just start there. I'm just going to turn the radius size down a bit. Let's just find a spot where it looks nicer. There we go. So let's say that's pretty much done for our corners. We can just duplicate all of this again by compressing Control D, Control R to link this back to the root node, and then linking in here again. Now, like I said before, for our lines, we want to change it from vertex to edge center. So you can see it's putting it on all the edges there. We want to make this into a cylinder. All right. And like we said before, we want to change the cylinder axis to be Z. Now it may look a bit weird here now, but don't worry, because when we come into clone to mesh and change our rotation mode to align to normals, you notice now that these cloned cylinders are all aligned with the edges we want them to be, but they're not the correct length. So we're going to come in here again and go scale clones by poly edge size. Okay, and somehow exactly at size 8, it looks like it's pretty perfect. Now this wouldn't always happen. So again, we're going to come in here, drop our radius down a bit more. And if it was like the shape you're using doesn't have the correct size, you can adjust the height here to make sure that you're getting it exactly where you need it to go. So if we were to come across now to this icosphere and we were to say, I want to throw on a deformer, let's go for turbulence because that's probably the one I use the most. Drop it in, drop it on. Now we ramp up our displacement. You'll notice that although the points are moving, we're not getting any weird deformations in the lines. They're staying nice and straight. Everything's stretching the way it should be. So if we crank this up to something like 8, this is absolutely going ham on itself, but none of the, if we pause it, none of the cylinders are being stretched in weird ways. It's all still working nicely and all of our points are still the same. So we can probably drop this down a little bit more. Alrighty, so that's how you can take a mesh object and deform it. Sorry, it's going a little crazy. Deform it inside of Notch with extruded edges so that it does still react nicely to light. So just for example, let's take this, Control D, make another one, make this one maybe orange, make it off axis, and make this one more of a blue. Just so you can sort of see that it does now take light. Cool. All right. I hope this was super useful. And yeah, have a fantastic week. Cheers.